My guest is a licensed acupuncturist and herbalist practicing in New York and New Jersey, with a deep commitment to women's health and well-being, including fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum care, just to name a few. While working in hospitals treating patients with acupuncture, it made her realize that she wanted to create a practice of her own with healing philosophies that combine both Eastern and Western medicine. Hello, Leah Kim, and welcome to my podcast, Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting. I even told my mom about this, and the first thing she said is, make sure I sound incredible.
Now, you are first-generation Korean American, is that correct?
I am. I'm technically what they call 0.5, meaning I was born in Korea, and I came here when I was very young and was brought up here in the States. So first generation would mean that you were
born
the first
here.
Generation being born here.
And both parents are Korean?
Both parents are Korean.
South Korean.
Mom's South Korean. Dad's family actually comes from the north.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Dad's mother was incredible. She was able to bring her 6 children by herself all the way from North Korea down to South Korea during the Korean War.
Where was her husband? Fighting?
My grandfather had passed from a biking accident when my dad was 5 and my youngest aunt was 3. So my grandmother, who is also an amazing person, she raised 6 children by herself, put all 6 children through college by herself, and then when my father got married, she and my youngest aunt, she took my youngest aunt with her, and she immigrated to America by herself and established herself here in New York, and then eventually was able to bring my whole family over.
So this is all your paternal grandmother and aunt.
This is my paternal grandmother.
Oh, my goodness. So they came over. And how old was your dad when he came to the States?
So my dad was probably, I was 4. Dad would have been only 32. So they were married in Korea, and my parents had all 3 of us. I have 3 sisters. We're all about a year apart. And then when my youngest sister was about 1.5, 2 years old, we immigrated here to the States. So I came when I was about 4. My middle sister was 3, and then my youngest sister was 2.
So we have to have a whole other episode of the podcast to talk about your paternal grandmother.
Yeah, and she and 2 other Korean ladies built one of the largest Korean churches in New York.
So will you come back and we can talk about your dad's side of the
family? Sure, we could totally talk about my grandmother.
What is your mom's name?
My mom's name is Jung Yoon Kim, Kim.
Could you spell that for me?
So that's Myunghee.
And your full Korean name is?
Jung Yoon, Jungyoon.
And then Leah Kim.
Mm-hmm. Leah is actually an adopted name that my mother made us adopt. So my sisters and I went by our Korean names throughout our whole childhood. And when we moved out to Long Island, it would have been my sophomore year in high school, we moved out there because of school issues. And it turned out my sisters and I and a handful of other minority children were in a predominantly white high school. And so I can't remember if someone suggested it or she thought of it. She thought that it'd be easier for us to acclimate to a predominantly white high school if we took on American names, which was fine by me because I had been so sick of people butchering my Korean name for years. And she said the only caveat was either my sisters and I pick a name from the Bible, or that one of us has to be named Sharon, because the flower of Korea is the rose of Sharon, Sharon. So she said, either going to pick names from the Bible, or one of you is going to be named Rose and the other is going to be named Sharon. And then she was like, the third person, we don't know, we'll just pick a name from the Bible.
So who picked what? Who got Sharon?
Nobody got Sharon because none of us wanted to be named Rose or Sharon. And there's a lot more names in the Bible that was, interesting. So we all picked names that I guess we resonated with. And I picked Leah, my sister picked Rebecca, and my younger sister obviously was not paying attention during Sunday school because she picked the name Elisha, spelled Elisha. Now, that is actually the spelling of the prophet Elisha. So she named herself after a prophet, a male prophet. Kind of befits her sort of, youngest child, like I'm the end-all, be-all.
So this is high school that you took an American name. Where were you living before when you first came to the U.S.?
We lived the majority of our young lives out in Queens, and it was very idyllic. We lived in a very safe area of Flushing and then an area called Fresh Meadows, and it was great. In junior high school, we'd play hooky, and we would take the bus or the subway into Manhattan, and, my friends and I would go down to Canal Street and, go hang out at Canal Jeans. And, one time we actually took the train all the way to Coney Island.
Is this like cutting school days? Your mom didn't know?
Oh, yeah. Mom had no idea. Mom and Dad. And then, of course, cutting school actually kind of continued on into high school in Long Island. So my mom and my dad would have to go to work early, so they would leave us. And our school was within walking distance from our house. It was maybe like a 25-minute walk. It was walkable. So at the time, none of us could drive. So my mom would stand in the doorway and watch us walk down towards the high school. And then she would get in her car and drive off. Well, my sisters and I knew that after a certain point, she can't see us. So we would hide in the bushes and then wait, for X amount of time that we knew it would take for her to get ready and drive out. And we'd just walk back home. And the three of us it would be a secret between the three of us. We'd stay home, we'd eat, we'd watch TV, do whatever. And, we didn't do this often, but it was, it was a little hard for us. We had so much freedom growing up in Queens, and Long Island was a little bit stifling for us. You couldn't get anywhere because there was no mass transit. Yeah. We were used to taking buses since we were young. Well, I was. My sisters were too young. I was used to taking buses and hopping on a subway and going somewhere, or we could walk to the local stores. So Long Island was a little bit
culture shock,
stifling for me. Yeah, and then being one of the 10 minority students in a predominantly white high school, it wasn't all that fun for us. So we were just like, maybe today we'll just stay home. And, the three of us would always have to say, we're in agreement, we're not telling Mom. And, of course, we'd all be like, yeah, of course. So it wasn't until much later, obviously, until we were, well into our adulthood, that we happened to tell our mom that this is what we used to do. And she just, she was in shock. And then she started to laugh. And she's like, you guys are such jerks. And I'm like, Mom, we at least got into good colleges. We're not derelicts. She's like, ugh. She's like, if I knew. I was like, if you knew, we'd be dead.
Did you speak Korean at home?
Yes. So it was the policy of our parents that in the house we could only speak Korean. And if we started to speak in English, they would correct us, or, we would get a punishment where we couldn't watch TV for an hour or something like that. So we only spoke Korean in the home. And, I'm grateful for that. It's why, my sisters and I are so relatively bilingual. But when we were younger, they wouldn't answer us if we spoke in English. It was very strict. And, as I said, I'm very grateful to my parents.
How was your mom's English?
my mom being at the time an at-home parent, we had a small community of Korean friends, so she didn't use it that much. It wasn't until later, I would say like later in grade school, where she was offered a job. My mom, having the educational background that she did, someone suggested to her, and so she had to learn how to speak English on the fly, and she actually had to teach herself English while she was teaching English to these young children.
No way. She taught English to Asian immigrant children?
Specifically Korean children. She was basically teaching herself the lesson that she was going to teach these young kids the next day.
Did they know that she didn't really know what she was doing?
Oh, yeah, she was honest with them, you know. They would know
smart.
that, like, she'd be like, you know, they would, of course, know that, like, Mrs. Kim doesn't know how to say these things. And so just to let you know, my mom graduated college as a teacher, and she opened up her own nursery school in Korea. And so she ran a nursery school. So I have very vague memories, but my whole house was a nursery school. It was a building, and we lived in the upstairs, and the nursery school was downstairs. I have these very vague memories of the house, and one of the most dearest memories I have is that my mom had this brilliant idea to create a little cubby, which was a slide, from the upstairs of our home. So I have a memory of sliding down to the nursery. Because she had this background in teaching, the New York public school system was so desperate for anybody to teach ESL classes that they hired her, even though she had such a limited command of the English language. But in those years, you know, she became very proficient, and she taught these kids. And a lot of times these Korean kids, their parents were working 12, 16 hours, and these kids didn't have a place to go after school. And so a lot of times my mom just brought some of these kids home to our house. And so there was this sense of, you know, you help out your community in any way, shape, or form. And I think that was probably the seed to my mom creating the pre-nursery and nursery school that she started with the church that my paternal grandmother started. And we ran a 5-borough pre-K, pre-nursery and pre-K out of that church. We had at one time 7 yellow buses that were going to all 5 boroughs, picking up children to bring it to our program.
Oh, this is so cool. I can't tell you how many guests have either been children of teachers or teachers themselves. They work so hard, and they could change your child's life, any child's life.
Mm-hmm. And there's a strata of Korean American children in the New York and New Jersey area that still remember my mom. Because she was the head of the pre-K nursery school, and because it was also run by our church, they would also, those who came to our church would see her, because my mom's a pastor, and she would also be doing the pre-K and K sermons on Sundays.
I didn't know your mom was a pastor.
My mom's a theologian. She is retired now, but she does help the Sunday school in Korea for the church that she attends there.
What was the name of the school in Queens?
The church is the Korean Church of Queens, and her nursery school was called Grace Daycare.
Is it still there? Do you know?
It is still there. It was really meant to promote the church and the Korean culture and the community. We sort of moved away from, really embracing community.
Who was the disciplinarian in the family?
Oh, Mom. Mom was definitely the disciplinarian. she was the everyday disciplinarian. Let me actually back up. She was the one that we obviously feared, and Dad was always the one that, like, we'd be like, oh, yay, Dad, like we'd run off to Dad. She was the everyday disciplinarian, but I think the majority of the time moms are the everyday disciplinarian. They're the ones that are usually saying, no, you can't do this, can't do that, get your homework done, because they're running the household. But my dad, he was a great disciplinarian, and even now my mom will concede to the fact that he may have screamed, but he never laid a hand on us. Mom spanked us every once in a while. She employed actually a very interesting psychological tactic. So if we got in trouble, my sisters and I, she would send us out into the backyard, and she would say, go out there and you pick the switch that you're going to, be basically disciplined with. And she said if you pick a bad one that breaks too easily or is too soft, then you're going to get one extra, lash. And so my sisters and I would go out there and would be like, stick. We call it meh, because you'd go meh, right? Mm. And then we'd, walk back in with our little twig, our meh stick, and my mom would, observe it and, kind of bend it. And the majority of the time, she'd just be like, well, this is pretty good, so, we're going to leave it and let it get stiffer. So you guys better get ready for the next time, you get in trouble. So the switch never really hit our bottoms. So, like I said, it was really more
a threat. Oh, my gosh. If you were upset, a broken heart, or who would hug you and embrace you and cuddle you, your mom or your dad?
We were lucky. Our parents were a lot more affectionate than what other Asian parents were like. According to some of my Asian friends, like growing up, their parents rarely gave them hugs or kisses or, said, I love you. In our family, it was doled out in moderation, but it was doled out by both parents. We were really lucky. If it was like a friendship heartbreak, Mom and Dad would give us very different things. It was interesting. Mom would always tell us to buck up and just give us a hug and tell us to move on. And Dad would be the one that sort of explained things, which sort of was the complete opposite of the way that I think, most people experience their parents. But I think part of that was, my mom is driven and my father is a dreamer.
How neat is that? And he's the engineer. The dreamer is the electrical engineer.
Yeah. It's funny. I think he sort of picked something he was passionate about, but he picked something that didn't speak to his innate nature. And it took my dad a long time to sort of find the thing he really loved doing and was good at. My mom was much more of a pragmatist, and, the pragmatic side of me comes from my mother. And, she always knew she wanted to be a teacher. She was good at it. She always had all these kids around her. She knew how to set them up and make sure that they were eating, put their shoes away. She was very much a pragmatist. So when it came to sort of the, boo-boo kissing and the hugging, not so much. It was pretty much Dad who'd be like, you're going to be okay, let's dust that off. And because of that, I think my sisters and I were much more lovey-dovey to our nieces and nephews. We're always kissing them, hugging them. We tell them we love them a lot more than I would say my counterparts, my friends who are of our age group and our ethnicity. If we needed a hug, they'd give us a hug. And you know what? Now, speaking to you, I just had a memory. I remember once asking my parents, why don't they ever really say, I love you? And, I remember it was my mom explaining that in Asian culture, they don't always say, I love you, but that they say it in what they do.
They show
you
it
know,
with their
and they
actions.
show it, right? And I remember her saying, we show it because we make sure you're in clean clothes. We show it to make sure that you're always having good, fresh food. You know, we show it because sometimes we discipline you so that you become a good person. So I remember that because I remember being a kid and watching on TV, or if I went to friends' homes, they'd just be like, I love you, honey, you know, like, be good.
So
Bye,
how old were
sweetie.
you? This is pretty great that you vocalized what you were thinking and feeling. Were you in high school already at this point?
No, this is grade school. I know it's grade school because I remember having a similar conversation with my mom and my dad. My dad didn't want to answer the question, but my mom did. So, do you remember, oh gosh, what was that show? It had Ricky Schroeder, Silver Spoons. So this was a sitcom in the, I'd say, early 80s, and it had Ricky Schroeder, who was like, you know, the teen dreamboat. You know, it was like this very blonde, Aryan child on TV. And, you know, I was just completely fascinated with this kid. And I remember one day I was in the bathroom pooping. That's what I was doing. And we only had one bathroom, so we had to be pretty comfortable and open with just, you know, walking in and being like, sorry, I have to wash my hands, or, you know, whatever. And I remember I was pooping, and my mom had to come in to get something in the bathroom. And I said, Mom, I have a question. And she goes, well, okay, when you're done, you know, come out and I'll answer it. So I remember her, you know, leaving the bathroom, finished pooping, did my business, and washed my hands, came out. And my mom was sitting at her vanity, which was right next to the bathroom. So I sat next to her, and, you know, I remember putting on her. It's interesting now that we're talking about, whenever I had questions, it was always next to my mom, watching her put on or taking off makeup in her vanity. So that's why I knew it was grade school when I asked her, why don't you say I love you? Because it was a conversation I used to have looking at her through the mirror, which I think maybe took away some of the directness. Because
Well, she was looking in the mirror and she wasn't have to look directly into your eyes.
right, we were talking through each other through the mirror.
Wow.
Because, yeah, it's funny now that I think about it while I'm talking to you about this on the phone. In Asian culture, to show respect, you don't stare into your parents' face. Like, you don't have eye-to-eye contact. You know, you show respect by slightly lowering your eye, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was actually a huge problem. It took my parents a long time to figure out what the hell was happening, because my sisters and I can't. My sisters had the same experience. We would go to school, a teacher would be telling us something, and we would lower our eyes out of respect. And the teacher thought we were being disrespectful and not paying attention, and we would get reprimanded, be like, look at me when I'm speaking to you. So then we would look at them because they were speaking to them, right? And then when we went back home and my parents were telling us something, we would look at them because they were speaking to us, and then they'd be like, you know, how dare you? That's a sign of defiance, right, in Korea. So they'd be like, don't look at me that way, you know, and then so we'd be completely confused. And it took us a long time until one day we realized that was the thing. And my mom and dad realized that we were confused as to where the hell we were supposed to look when we were talking to them. So I think the whole reason we would have questions, you know, it's so interesting when you start talking about these things, what comes up. It was easier to ask questions because we were speaking to each other through the mirror, and, you know, she was always doing something. So it was never like we sat down in a TLC movie where you see mothers and daughters sitting down and be like, so, honey, you know, do you have
This
any
is how it works.
yeah, like, no.
Yes, it's
My parents never
easier to
had
have
that.
the conversation. Oh, my
Exactly.
gosh.
If we were going to have a conversation like that, like sitting across from each other,
Mm-hmm.
we were in big trouble. That was it. We were obviously in big trouble if we were going to have a conversation like that. But if we were having a conversation where I'd ask questions, interestingly, with my mom, it was generally when she was putting her makeup on or taking it off, and we were talking to each other via the mirror.
So what was the question? Was the question the I love you? How come you don't say I love you when you came out of the bathroom?
Well, that was,
or was the cute blonde,
that was
the Aryan?
No, I asked her, I was like, Mom, do white people poop, or is this something only Koreans do? And I remember her laughing. Yeah. And she goes, no, everybody poops.
Oh,
and
my
I was
gosh.
like, even Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States? She goes, yes, everybody poops. I'm like, even my teacher? She's like, yes, everybody poops. Pooping is a natural thing. I'm like, I don't think Ricky Schroeder poops. And she was just like, he does. I'm telling you, he poops. And I'm like, they never show him pooping on TV. And she was like, well, pooping is very private. And I said, but do you come in when I poop? And she says, that's because we're family. She's like, pooping is never something that's embarrassing when it's family. So.
And I wonder when she and your dad were together late at night talking or something, would they just be laughing hysterically?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean,
Like Rick
you
and
tell
I.
your husband, like, oh my God, guess what? Guess what your daughter said today? She thought that the president of the United States didn't poop because he was white.
You are comfortable talking about a lot of things that, other people would say, can I say this?
Yeah, oh my God, my whole family loves talking about poop. Like, it's such a natural thing, and it's such an important thing to understand about your body because it's such an indicator of health.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's cleansing. You don't want those toxins building up, It's
No,
very important. It's very cleansing.
It's very cleansing. It's also, for a lot of people, their only time that they're actually being still.
Being still. Oh, my gosh,
and
right.
listening to their bodies, right?
Mm-hmm. Letting their bodies make the decision instead of them controlling everything.
Exactly. It's one of the very few times where you truly have to be relaxed to be able to go.
So I am Jackie Tantillo, and you're listening to Should Have Listened to My Mother, a weekly podcast where I get to have these wonderful conversations with Leah Kim, who is my friend and my acupuncturist and a healer, and we talk about nutrition and well-being, physical and mental. You are so generous with these stories. You told me a story, how your mom used to have you go outside in the freezing cold, not a lot of jackets to build up your immune. Can you tell that story?
So my mom, it's a little bit of tradition in Korea. They don't do it because I think now they think it's child abuse. The idea is to start to, toughen up your children's immune system. So when we were little, my mom would send us out into the backyard in the middle of the winter or at the start of the winter when the air was cold or if there would be snow. And she would send us out in shorts and maybe a hat and a light sweater and boots or something. And she'd tell us to go stand out there and play or stand out there, for some time, and then she'd let us in. And obviously we'd have something warm to drink after, but the whole point of it was to get our bodies acclimated to the cold. Well, so now you can imagine, here is my mother standing inside, watching us from inside, and here's her 3 little Asian daughters basically running around in the backyard in their underpants, right? And our neighbors looking through the window going, what the hell is this woman doing? Her children are running around in basically half naked outside in the middle of winter. And I guess at the time we had, on one side of our house, we lived in a duplex, was a Japanese family who totally knew what we were doing, and never said anything, we'd wave to each other. And then the other side, we had this sort of older white couple who we loved, but, they'd watch us do this. And one year they came out and they're like, what are you guys doing outside? And we're like, we're playing. And they saw my mom and they're like, for some reason, they called my mom Kathy. I guess because they couldn't pronounce my mother's name and they just chose Kathy as this random American name to call my mom. Mm-hmm. And my mom just accepted it. And so they'd be like, Kathy, what are your children doing outside half naked? And my mom in her broken English was trying to explain to them, for health. And they're like, they're going to catch a cold, take them inside. And I think that was probably the end of when my mom stopped sort of doing these things to try to strengthen our immune system. Because, she got chastised by our neighbors, and she thought, maybe this is America. Maybe they're right. This is their way to make my children healthier. And then at some point, we were told, feed your kids lots of, make them drink milk. It's so healthy for you. So I remember my mom forcing us to drink glasses of milk. And, I personally hated milk. And we'd cry and complain. The only one of us that actually really liked milk was my middle sister, who happens to be a good 3 inches taller than my sisters and my other sister.
See what happens when you don't drink your milk?
No. Now I'm like, I should have drank my milk. The funny thing was, I grew up with having intestinal problems. Well, hello. Many years later, you realize, most Asian children are lactose intolerant or lactose sensitive.
Did your mom give up a lot of cultural traditions to fit in? Did she feel pressured to assimilate?
No, you know what? She did a good job balancing things out. An example would be, she always made sure that my grandmother sent us new hanboks, which is the Korean, traditional clothing, so that we always had new hanboks for like New Year's, that whenever we grew out of one set, that she would request a second set. So we always felt like, this is such special clothing. We're getting dressed up in our hanbok. But then she also did things like perm my sisters and I our hair so we'd look like Little Orphan Annie, because that was very popular, if you remember. And she thought this would be awesome. So there are pictures of my sisters and I where we literally have a massive fro.
I apologize if my laughter comes across
as
being
it's
insensitive.
Hilarious. No, they're hilarious. Like, my sisters and I are standing there, and we've got this massive Orphan Annie fro on top of our heads.
So she did want you guys to kind of fit in, or, I don't know her reasoning.
Yeah, well, my mom was also very much a fashion plate. Both my parents were a little bit of fashion plate. So part of that was they just always wanted to make sure we looked respectable. I think part of it, just like that, the sort of discrimination back in the 70s and 80s for Asian children was that we were poor. Most Americans' experience as Asian children or Asians were like we were refugees, especially more on the East Coast than the West Coast. And I think she always wanted to make sure that we looked presentable, that we looked really well kept, because it was very important to her.
Well, again, all the things that parents do to show they love you,
mm-hmm.
without the kids really thinking about it or knowing about the reasons why. Well, you also mentioned something about chasing the chicken down the Long Island Expressway.
Oh.
We are running a little late because I still want to talk about your business and all the magical work that you do, but is there a way we could share this?
So this is a very infamous story. So my sisters and I were all away in college, and at that time my grandmother was living with my mom, and I remember calling my mom and saying, "Hey, Mom, what's up? What's going on?" And she was like, things are a little exciting at the house. And I said, "Why?" She's like, your grandmother, who is also a hoot, she's building a chicken coop in the basement. She's amazing. She's the one that taught me to knit, to sew, to cook." And I was like, "Why is she building a chicken coop in our basement?" She goes, "Well, we found a chicken on the LIE." Just the statement alone, we found a chicken on the Long Island Expressway. I'm like, "What?" She's like, "Oh, yeah, I was driving back from church with your grandma, and all of a sudden your grandma starts screaming, pull over, chicken, pull over. My mom's like, what? So she pulls over to the shoulder. My grandmother jumps out. And now you got to picture this. Long Island Expressway, tiny little blue Chevrolet, pulls off to the highway, and out pops these two little Asian people, women, and they are now frantically running up and down the shoulder of the LIE.
For those who don't know, the Long Island Expressway, otherwise known as the LIE, it's 3 lanes, the main thoroughfare east and west from Manhattan out to Long Island. And
that's correct.
Traffic and speeding cars and mayhem all the time. So here they are, these two trying to catch a chicken.
Chicken. Like, what the hell is a chicken doing on the
Side
shoulder
of
of
the
an
road.
LIE, right? So there they are. They're running around trying to catch this chicken, and they finally catch it. They get in the car. They drive home, and now my grandmother is elated because now she's got a chicken, and she's now currently building a chicken coop in the basement. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, what? First of all, like, what's a chicken doing on the LIE? And she's like, I don't know, but your grandma saw it, and now she has a pet. She's like, leave your grandmother alone. She needs something to do. She's got a chicken now. She's going to take care of the chicken. And I'm like, I don't know. What if it's a chicken that got loose from some sort of, research center? She's like, no, Grandma thinks it's just a regular chicken from somebody's home because, there was a string attached to one of its feet. And I was like, what does that have to do with anything? And she's like, well, usually when you raise chickens, you tie a string when they're young to one of their legs so that they're restricted. And after a while, they no longer go beyond a certain boundary. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
I remember briefly hearing something about that. I don't know
so,
if it's cruel and unusual punishment or...
Exactly, but this is how my grandmother justified that this was not a radioactive chicken, that somehow got loose from a research center. There was a string attached to its ankle. So the chicken stayed in the basement, and then spring came, and it was spring break, so my sisters and I were all heading home. And I was the last one to come down. And so my mom picks me up from the train station, and we're driving, and I'm like, oh, I'm so excited, to see Grandma. And she goes, she turns out, she goes, don't mention the chicken. I'm like, what? She's like, don't mention the chicken. I'm like, okay, why? She's like, your grandmother is extremely upset. And I'm like, why? She's like, because, it was nice, the weather was nice, so your grandma decided to take the chicken and the chicken coop and put it in the backyard, and, so she set up the chicken coop so the chicken could get some sun, and how our neighbor, they have that big dog and and I said, the neighbor from the back? I was like, yes. Well, he somehow got into our yard and ate the chicken, and your grandma is so upset. She's so upset. Don't mention the chicken. We spent the whole week with my grandma and my mom and my dad, and we're having a great week. And it's the last dinner before all three of us are going back to school. So my grandma, of course, made this humongous table of delicious Korean food, right? And, we're all sitting and, all of our favorite dishes are there, and, we're eating and laughing, and my grandma goes, so did you like the tofu stew? Was it spicy enough? And I was like, oh, yeah. My sister's like, oh, my God, it was delicious. It was great. And then all of a sudden, slowly we see my mom and my grandmother giggling. And so we're like, what's so funny? And they're giggling. And I'm like, and my sisters and I are like, okay. And then all of a sudden my mom starts pointing to the stew and laughing. She's like, that's the chicken. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, that's the chicken. That's the chicken we've been raising for you guys.
Oh, my gosh.
And my sisters are like, the LIE chicken? She's like, yeah, that's the chicken. And my sisters and I, for like a split second, we were like, no. And then we realized, well, it was good. It's in our stomach. What are we going to do?
Oh, my God.
So my mom and my grandmother planned this whole story
So there was
because
no
they
dog.
knew, right,
Oh,
because they
my
knew
gosh.
if they told them that that was the chicken that they found on the LIE that they raised specifically so they can actually give fresh chicken to their daughters, they knew they would never eat it. Because we're an American. Why would I eat a chicken that you just freshly killed? Especially when they found it on the LIE.
They were in cahoots the whole time.
They completely made up the story so that they can present the tofu chicken stew that we, of course, devoured.
Oh,
So it was
great.
deception to just be able to give us, love through fresh chicken.
Always love first. Love shown in all different ways.
We're lucky. Our family has a very good sense of humor on both sides of the family, and I think this was just one way of deciding to get a good laugh out of their children.
We have so much more to talk about. You went to RISD, and then you went on to get a master's in science and become an acupuncturist and a healer and a doula and a yoga instructor and a cranial sacral practitioner. You certainly are so giving to your patients and clients and friends. And it comes through in so many ways. So I want to thank you for sharing all these wonderful stories so we get a little bit understanding of not only the cultural differences, but just each of our life experiences. They're all unique and special in one way, shape, or form.
Well, thank you for having me. And now I'm going to have to call my mom and be like, Mom, did you realize that when we talked through the mirror, that was a way to circumvent the uncomfortableness that, in our culture of like talking face to face, like that was a total eye-opener for me.
That's pretty cool. It happens when I start these conversations. It just makes the wheels start to spin. And that's one of the many wonderful things that I love about doing this. So I'm glad that came to mind. I'm really glad. Leah Kim, acupuncturist, practices in New York and New Jersey. If anyone needs any help with so many different issues that we're all afflicted with these days and you're in the area, I suggest you get in touch with her, or you could always reach out to me at Jackie@shouldhavelistenedtomymother.com. It is a weekly podcast that I get to host. Leah Kim has been this week's guest. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you, Jackie, and it was so much fun to just tell my stories and actually get a great response from you.